Welcome to Unblocked Live. We are live. My guest today is Brendan Gutenschwager, BG on the scene, as you know him on Twitter and YouTube, all platforms. We're going to get a chance to talk about what it's been like reporting from the ground. BG is just back from Minneapolis recently, and then was it Detroit? You were on the ground before that.
Yep.
So we're going to compare notes, talk about what we've seen on the ground, talk about what it's been like covering for most of this last year, protests and civil unrest from the ground. And we got a lot to talk about on Unblocked Live. Welcome to the show, Brendan.
Thank you for having me. Always great to be here.
My guest today is Brendan Gutenschwager. You can follow him at BG on the scene. We're going to have a chance to talk about what it's been like this last year covering protests from the street. This is the Anti-Polarization Podcast, Unblocked Live. Please feel free to ask questions and comment. We are live. Brendan, thank you for being back, and I'm excited to get a chance to talk to you because it's always interesting from a street view what you see, especially as you're the guy I keep saying that probably gets around the most. I never know where you're going to be, but I take it you're taking a couple days off. You haven't tweeted in a few days. Is this some welcome rest?
A little bit. I mean, you could say that. It just gets to be very overwhelming, like, constantly going out, boom, boom, boom. If it was more remote reporting or something like that, I think I could keep up every single day a little bit more. But when it's like out in the field reporting, it's nice after being gone for a bit to take a little bit of time off. And as it turned out with Minneapolis, the way that the closing of the Chauvin trial conjoined with the Daunte Wright protest, which, I mean, that was a new incident that had popped up right there in April. That was just a very, very chaotic few weeks covering everything. So the last couple of days, taking it a little bit easier, although still a lot of work to do behind the scenes, but not so much on the scene.
Absolutely. And for those who are following protest movements, there doesn't seem to be any sign that things are really letting up. In our collective consciousness, we might find that there's some closure with the Chauvin trial and since the death of George Floyd, but and we'll get into the difference between what you saw perhaps in Brooklyn Center, which is just outside of Minneapolis proper, right? What's the relationship? Like, how would you describe the difference between Brooklyn Center and Minneapolis? They're two different cities, but I imagine you have the same scene and the same group of folks that could come in and protest or go from one to the next.
Yeah, and they're only about 15 minutes apart in terms of like downtown Minneapolis to that Brooklyn Center police station, which is the epicenter of the protest there. And it was a lot of the same crowds that were, out of the Minneapolis protests out at these Brooklyn Center ones as well as some, Brooklyn Center community people too. But I think that the timing of that definitely played a role in just the sheer amount of media attention that was there and the volume of people that were able to like immediately mobilize, because some people were already around for the Chauvin trial protests. Those were ongoing. So I think that definitely played a role for sure on the media side, because there was just such a flood of media on those protests. And I remember thinking to myself, like, all these people were just in town, like 15 minutes away over in Minneapolis, covering things outside the courthouse. Now they have something to do, in terms of coverage later at night, that there's still something else going on. And so, yeah, I think that definitely played a role there.
Now, so take us back to Brooklyn Center, and there were a few nights of rioting. We did not see rioting after the Chauvin verdict, though, in Minneapolis. Is that correct? Were you surprised by that? Take us a little through that, what you saw.
Yeah, well, in terms of the Brooklyn Center one, there were like that very first night, that Sunday night, there were the kind of more widespread looting. Second night, a little bit more tampered down, but still some various looting, a few buildings that were lit on fire. And as far as I know, then after that is where it started to kind of taper off in regards to Brooklyn Center. And I remember like on those first two nights too, a little bit of that had spread into Minneapolis too, even though it wasn't a Minneapolis incident per se, it was Brooklyn Center Police. There was still like looting at a Target in Minneapolis, etc. So that definitely all kind of conjoined there. But once the Chauvin verdict came in, there was the closing arguments that Monday, verdict came in that Tuesday, and I think that the like unambiguity of the verdict, the fact that it was guilty on all three counts, there was really no guilty on one count but innocent on the other two or anything like that. I think that definitely played a role in the reaction that you saw in Minneapolis, which was a peaceful, mostly just celebratory demonstrations outside the courthouse there downtown, and then later on over in George Floyd at the memorial there. And I think that the fact that it was just a very clear-cut verdict didn't take a whole lot of time to come to as well. It wasn't like something where like the jury was deliberating for weeks, everybody was on the edge of their seats. It wasn't like that. It was more just really just one day. The closing arguments came on that Monday. By Tuesday, right around noon or 12:30 is when they announced that they were going to have the verdict that afternoon. So it was very quick, and I think that the protesters and the people out there recognized that, and a lot of them were speaking and saying like this is a rare moment that they saw where they could actually take a night to. Some people pushed back at the characterization of it as celebrating, because some people said the whole thing in their view is just so tragic that you can't really use that kind of terminology. But others were willing to say that like it was a moment of celebration for what their movement had been gearing towards and what they had been, hoping to actually accomplish. So that was the Minneapolis reaction there.
And were you able to visit the zone which is known as George Floyd Square? This is the about 1.5 to 2 block radius section near the Cup Foods where he was killed. And I visited it in December, and there are various memorials and street art. There are checkposts also on all 4 sides. Was that still the case, or did they open that up, or were people after the verdict moving more freely into that neighborhood, that area?
From what I saw, it did seem to be much more freedom of movement in terms of near the end of the verdict compared to at the start of the trial, because I actually had visited there right around that second week of March when the trial first began, and it was more closed off, more secluded, kind of more held as a private space. Then near the end of the verdict, you saw more people just kind of going in and out freely. Media was a bit more welcome in there too, where they hadn't been so much back in March. In some cases were actually like actively kicked out and, pressured to not be there. It seemed to be much more open in April, although still the checkpoints were still there. There were still people posted at those different, the 4 main crossroads where you would enter. But it did seem that they were a little bit more relaxed in terms of letting kind of just anybody come in and out. Other than police, we didn't see there. Obviously, it's still held as a no police zone, but in terms of just general public or media there.
We saw that. We saw there was a viral video of a fellow who was getting kicked out from even outside the square. He was not even in it. He was near the barricade, and they still said it's going to be a problem if you're here. When it comes to press being welcome, certainly in the last year, it's pushed my understanding of, I guess, what people are willing to, how far they're willing to go to control a message or get cameras out of the way that they think are adversarial, whether they're right or not. And I've had, both you and I have had recent incidents in our coverage where we ran up against some pushback. Tell us about Detroit. And we haven't seen a lot from Detroit as far as video coverage and protests. Is that just because of what has made it out from the protest scene in Detroit? In other words, there are so many like random cities and towns where I hear of protests, and people keep sending me information saying, hey, this was here, did you know it? And it's like, no, I had no idea that so much was going on somewhere I hadn't heard of. What has Detroit been like up to this point? And what was the friction that you ran into a couple weeks ago when you were covering Detroit?
Yeah, so Detroit has had actually very, very consistent protests since the late May with the death of George Floyd and the nationwide protests that were sparked after that. And there was one organization in particular that sort of condensed a lot of the protest scene regarding that, like the energy with the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera, and has since organized a lot of the protests throughout the summer, throughout the fall, winter, and then going now into the spring. And they've been largely peaceful. I mean, early on, there were face-offs with police. You did have those different moments with like riot gear, et cetera. Although that was present in a lot of different cities at that time, if we're talking like late May or early June. But really after that, in the months since, there was one incident in late June where a cop car had purportedly, there was some sort of interaction, and I don't want to speak too detailed on it because I wasn't personally present to witness it, but basically some protester had come into contact with a cop car, allegedly the cop car, and so there were definitely some frustration and reaction around that. But otherwise, since then, in terms of like July onward, mostly just peaceful protests, and they've focused on different things. They've done more general like Black Lives Matter movement. They've focused on Detroit specific incidents where Detroit police have killed somebody, and then also kind of tying it into other national movements, Dante Wright, or some other recent ones. Well, and actually too, not even necessarily all just police killings or things like that. Anti-eviction, that was another one of their main, throughout the last couple months, especially in the winter going now into the spring, was advocating for having police basically have no role in any kind of eviction, and also to just stop evictions in general in the city of Detroit. And that actually was the theme of the protest that I had gone to cover a couple weeks ago. And it did take me aback because these protests have been largely peaceful in Detroit. For all the incidents that you may hear of in other cities or other ways that things have gone down, really with Detroit, it has been peaceful movement. They have not had too many face-offs with police where there were major interactions there either. And so, I was just attempting to cover one of these marches that was going through Detroit. It was going through on a Saturday afternoon, beautiful day out, I remember, through some of the busiest neighborhoods in Detroit, downtown and Greektown, which are heavily populated with both locals and tourists, especially on a Saturday afternoon like that. So this is definitely like a high visibility protest. I mean, they were marching through some of the most populated areas in the city during one of the most popular times, Saturday afternoon. But they had singled me out specifically because I had covered the Capitol, and basically there were a few people in this protest security team, and they have these security squads now that basically will go kind of around the perimeter of a protest as they're marching and try to identify people that they feel are a threat, try to kick people out. Otherwise, just kind of like general sort of like intelligence recon sort of thing to, let each other know what they're seeing, what they're observing. And so they had seen me and just immediately were ready to kick me out, immediately were ready to take action, kick me out. And when asked why, because really it wasn't, it wasn't like there was like illegal activity that was going on, or really there was no real explanation as to why they wouldn't want this covered, because other local news outlets were out there, they were covering it, they were photographing it. So it was really unclear. And then they specified that it was because of the Capitol, that basically because I had covered the Capitol, and they felt that by nature of me covering the Capitol, I must have had something to do with it, which is kind of a ludicrous argument to make, considering that I had also been covering their protests for the last how many months, going all the way back to actually this group's inception back in June. And so it was kind of like a just very ludicrous argument, to be quite frank with you. There really was no grounding in truth in that. And but because of that, they decided to escalate to violence, to steal my camera, to assault me. One person had charged at me from a distance, ran me into a concrete barricade, and they had bloodied up my lip, actually bloodied up my leg a little bit too, elbow. And then they basically just laughed about it. And then they all kind of like came around and were laughing, joking, "Oh, your lip's bleeding." And basically furious that I was out there covering this. There was also this argument that I had been like somehow connected to some movements that I was in no way connected to. I mean, it was all just basically a whole bunch of made up things about me. And based on that made up information, they took it straight to assault on first sight there. And that's
Wow.
very, very concerning, because it wasn't even something where, oh, a person gets confronted verbally and there's a chance to discuss there, or a chance to kind of explain yourself. No chance ever given, none whatsoever. It's just, we assume that you must have something to do with this based on our assumptions, and so you're done right from the get-go. And even though that logic makes no sense, considering that I've covered so many different events, such a wide variety all over, none of that matters. None of that matters.
This is eerily similar to what I experienced in Hollywood
Really.
and Huntington Beach. Because what happened to me in Huntington Beach is somebody posted a picture of me. Now, they didn't tag me in it, but they posted the picture of me. I had taken my mask off because I was on the pier, and I don't have a problem showing my face. And so I'm sitting there, I'm in shorts as it is. And it's a day on the Huntington Beach Pier where there was supposed to be a White Lives Matter rally, as it was billed from Telegram chatter. Now, of course, that did not materialize, certainly on a large scale. There were individuals that were cited that did have extreme white supremacists like tattoos. And there was a moment where a guy with a Nazi swastika on his arm, and you can hear me in the video saying, hey, what's the story behind the swastika tattoo? What's the story behind? But before all this happens, somebody who is a regular in the greater Los Angeles area decided to post that picture of me without a mask on and said, this is far-right propagandist Jeremy Lee Quinn, who stormed the Capitol, who is here in the crowd. So he that's how I get characterized. I know it's so
Very similar. That's crazy.
It's crazy,
It's crazy.
similar. Because the idea is it's beyond people's understanding that there's freedom of movement for the press, that we would be able to go from one quote unquote side to the next and do an honest job of just documenting straight up. And what this did, though, here's the interesting part about it. His tweet got more engagements, as far as like 400 and something likes and more, and 100 and something retweets or whatever. That got more engagement than all his other stuff, which was just documenting, here's this. When they found an actual white supremacist, and a former KKK guy named Hagen, and he had a cane. It was an old school like KKK guy. He posted that. He posted the guy with the swastika. None of that got the engagement that the fake thing of this. I've just exposed this person right here, and in this salacious way. Now, never mind that it's completely false and wrong. The lie travels more than the truth. And that startled me. So right before this conversation, we haven't talked in a couple of weeks. You asked me, am I quote unquote retiring from covering protests? Certainly from live streaming for me, because what I realize is when they can find you in the crowd and they know you're there, and you put out, if you're live streaming and you're trying to bring it to people live, I'm not somebody who has ever monetized that. There are people who do it well and they stream and they interact with their audience. I would say I'm more dabbled in it, but it does put you at risk if somebody mischaracterizes you to the security culture, whoever is running the security apparatus. If they have false information, it quickly can escalate. Now, I'm curious. So it went straight to assault in your situation. Did you ever get your camera back, or was it outright stolen?
Yeah, thankfully I did. Basically, they had tossed it over a fence into this parking lot, to where I then had to go run around into the parking lot and grab it. And that's how actually then I end up sort of on another side of a fence when you see part of the video that I had posted from there. And then the people are just continuing to taunt me from the other side of the fence there. And in the ultimate irony, well, Just an interesting tidbit. Irony maybe isn't the best word to use for it, but it was interesting that there was a security lady driving around the parking lot, and her only concern after watching all that go down, because all that had gone down literally right next to her parking lot, and they had basically assaulted me right there, pushed the arcade, thrown my property over the fence, and then her concern was just that I was then on the other side of the fence there in her parking lot, and she's like, "You can't be here." She drives up and says, "You can't be here," and I'm just like,
you're talking about like a private security vehicle?
yeah, it's just like a private security vehicle. And I'm just like, yeah, I know. Like, I'm not trying to be in this parking lot right now. There's, in case you didn't notice, there's like something that led to me ending up in this parking lot right now. Yeah, and is just really, really unfortunate to see on so many fronts, because it is that sort of, it's this misinformation that leads to real world violence, and that's something that's really concerning. And I think it also speaks to the way that people view the media, that they don't basically, when they see an actual independent press that's out there not spinning something, they can't believe it when they see it. I think that actually is part of it, because that's so rare in so much of the media landscape. All these different outlets seem to, have one spin or another, or they're just such established entities that have been around for so long, 40 years, 50 years, sometimes nearly 100 years for some of these outlets, that alone kind of saves them in ways that a newer person or a newer outlet just couldn't. And I think it's just like, it's so hard to believe that there would be anybody out there, like you said, that could actually go to both sides and just report honestly of that they have to try to characterize it some other way. They have to try to find some other way to explain it away. Oh, he must be this. We must characterize him as this, because that's the only possible reason he would be out of these protests, but was also out of that. And even though that doesn't actually make any sense, and I've been doing this for years. I've been doing this before their organization was even founded, including protests in the city of Detroit before their organization was founded. And that's not to single anybody out or any organization out, but I mean, if you're going around and your security is assaulting journalists on the street just for doing their job, that is a really, really big concern. And it was upsetting too to see that in Detroit specifically, because Detroit protests have not been known for that. There are other independent press out at those protests. You had asked earlier, and I don't think we got a chance to touch on it, that you don't really see a whole lot out of Detroit. And it's true, actually. Usually the Detroit protests, and, kind of just speaking to the national media and what they like to run in terms of story-wise, if they're mostly peaceful protests and there haven't been many incidents for the most part over the last few months, generally just doesn't make too many headlines. And that doesn't prevent me from going out and covering it. And it seemed like something like that would be something that was recognized, or that people would kind of realize that he's out covering even ones that are kind of more nondescript protests, kind of lower key, without major incident, etc. But again, it just, in terms of the national media landscape, has not picked up on too many of the Detroit protests, though they have been ongoing. And I think that's worth mentioning, but a lot of the media is either just lower level, just localized, or it just doesn't reach the national level from there.
So what's interesting is that we were in similar situations. You got the tougher end of it because they physically attacked you. Now, the same night that I was in Hollywood, it was a Justice for Deontay Wright and Adam Toledo protest. This was, I guess, 2 weekends ago. I was in Hollywood, and it was days after Huntington Beach. So my picture had been out there in the scene, and I actually did something unusual, which is I found the guy who had posted it, and I walked up to him before a protest, and I said, "Hey, I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn. You posted that I'm a far-right propagandist who stormed the Capitol. That's not an accurate description of me, and I would like to personally ask you for a retract it or challenge me on my, to retract it or challenge me on my work." We ended up having a conversation that lasted about 20 minutes. And there was one other young lady who was there who was witnessing it. And he still, by the end, he still insisted that I was far right. And it was just like, look, I'm telling you, take my word for it. I'm not I've never even voted for a right-wing candidate. Like, come on, just like have a conversation with me. And I think what it speaks to is that people are so used to curating their experiences online, whether it's you're on Twitter or you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram, you're curating everything that you show, and you're casting people and labeling them in these time to wake up. Time to wake up.
Yeah, 1 second. Sorry about that.
No problem. If he was taking a nap to prepare for the live cast, then it's totally understandable.
I realized that was still set there.
No worries at all. So anyhow,
They're so used to curating. Yeah.
There is a expectation that you can control the messaging. So when something happens that is outside of that comfort, then it's sort of habitually, well, wait, I can't label this person the way that I wanted to. There's an insistence that this person belongs in this column of people we cannot trust, even though it's just perpetuated maybe by a rumor mill or some sort of speculation, because our situations are similar in the sense that people knew we were in DC. And I even asked the guy, I said, look, if you were there and you were looking at your Twitter feed and you were sitting in a motel and you saw that there was a breach, wouldn't you get your ass over to the Capitol and start filming? I think you would. Let's be honest with you. And he finally admitted, he said, yeah, I would have done it too. And so it's like, okay, it's just, thank you. Thank you for giving me that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for giving me that. If you're there and you're covering the action, then you go to where the action is. And it doesn't mean that you endorse it and that you should be forever associated in the way that they want you to be, So your situation's very different though, because it sounds like, how did it get so quickly to physical contact?
Well, really, they just immediately had decided to come up and try to steal my camera and push me up against the wall. So that was like the very, very first interaction before any words were even spoken, other than them saying, "You're not welcome here," as he's pushing me into a wall. There was a previous incident, and this is one that I hadn't spoken out on. And this kind of just, I was trying to maintain professionalism. I wasn't trying, I hate to ever make myself not just the center of the story, but even really a part of it. Like, cause that's not my goal when I go out there. I'm not trying to infuse myself into the story in some way. It's something where I'm really just trying to report on what's going on. But there was a previous protest. This same group had, a lot of their members had gone to this protest, although actually it was more widespread. It wasn't just one group that was going to this protest in Grosse Pointe Park, which is a nearby suburb of Detroit. And that was there was an incident that had happened there. There was a black woman that lives there. Her neighbor had put up a KKK flag in his window facing her. And so that incident sparked outrage, and there was a protest planned, just like a peaceful Sunday afternoon protest. I believe it was organized actually by the local NAACP chapter. So it was actually like not this group, the same group that I would later encounter in Detroit the next month, that organized this. However, a lot of their members did go and did march for this. And they put their same security team to that protest march. And so that was actually my first encounter with them. And that was in March of 2021. So it was about 2 months after the Capitol. And very first thing right off the bat, it was attempt to break my camera. And you were really just escalating right to there from the get-go. And then when asked, like, what are you doing? Like, what's going on? You were at the Capitol. You were at the Capitol. And but at that point, a person is so ingrained in what their mindset is of you, if they're already escalating to that level of violence before they've even talked to you, before they've even, try to give any sort of, hey, like, what are you about? Like, why were you there? Nothing like that. It's just these assumptions right off the bat. And basically saying that because of that was not welcome to cover these protests. even though it actually wasn't even their group's protest that they had organized, but their security team had decided to, take it upon themselves to be security for this protest. And I don't know what kind of permissions they may have. I mean, it's possible they may have coordinated, or maybe not. And I won't make any assumptions on that, but I do know that they were basically playing this role of security for that protest in Grosse Pointe Park. And really, it was the exact same logic, exact same reasoning. And so then encountering me again a month later in Detroit, it was escalate to even more violence because I basically hadn't, stayed away and stopped covering things. Basically, the Grosse Pointe Park was more or less kind of like a warning shot, if you want to characterize it in a way. And then Detroit was just escalating to further violence, basically because I refused to be silenced, I guess. I mean, it's very frustrating because the reality is that, I am really just going out there to cover things as they happen, no matter what it is, no matter whether it's a left-wing event, right-wing event, events that don't even really have political affiliation necessarily. I mean, I was over at the Michigan State Capitol in late January, so still like post-Capitol, covering a protest. It was actually mostly high schoolers, but also like some coaches and people associated with high school athletic programs that were protesting some of the measures in the state against school sports. Yeah, the COVID restrictions on sport. And so it's like that's not even like left-wing or right-wing event. And so when you see these confrontations like I had in Grosse Pointe Park in Detroit, a lot of information has to be discarded and totally ignored for people to come to these conclusions. And it's actually, it blows my mind how much information is discarded in the pursuit of trying to convince themselves that I must be this person. And I say that because even after I state that I'm not, and even after I make it very clear that I'm not, and that their assumptions are false, there's absolutely no budging. There's absolutely no give back on that. There's no reasoning. It's just, they're in charge, they feel, and so they take action based on how they feel they want to. And they had mentioned in Grosse Pointe Park that they accepted violence if they felt it was necessary, because I had explicitly asked them about that. And in April, that's exactly what they did. They escalated it to violence because they felt that was necessary.
So when you were asking them that, was that part of an interview or?
Well, I mean, more of a confrontation, I would say.
That was part of the
and not of my own choosing. That was them confronting me. And in the process, I brought up the fact that they had taken what was a totally peaceful protest in Grosse Pointe Park. Absolutely no incident. These are not protests like you hear about in some other places with window smashing or things like that. We are talking a 100% peaceful protest until the security team decides to accost somebody, try to break their camera, and then basically like kind of hold them to the side to let the rest of the group go while they then do this sort of like interrogation thing. And that's where in that sort of that interaction there, whatever you want to call it, interrogation, I wouldn't exactly call it an interview. I pushed back and said, well, are you condoning this violence on this otherwise peaceful protest? And they said, if it's necessary. And that was that incident. It was some of the same people then in the next month there in April that I encountered in Detroit. And they basically just decided to assault me in broad daylight because they felt that I must have had something to do with the Capitol. That was their assumption. So,
and I don't know if people understand how little time you have to convince a section of a mob that you're there as an honest broker, that you're there to really just document. And it's interesting that you say that it was an otherwise peaceful protest, because this is exactly what happened in Hollywood a couple of weekends ago. Now, there were 2 nights I showed up in Hollywood after the Huntington Beach incident where somebody posts the false information about me. On one night, I show up and I actually label, I'm going to confront the person that doxed me. Now, I decided not to on like a live stream and I thought about it for a long time. I said, okay, this would make interesting content, but is this really what I want to do? Will I be making myself part of the story? Will I be breaking from a tradition that I've had, which is to just be a fly on the wall? And I came to the answer that yes, it may be, worthwhile to mention that, but to actually live stream or record and post the conversation, I didn't think had any actual news value. So I decide not to do it. That first night, a conservative that was in Black Bloc documenting, an actual conservative blogger who I get to that understanding of his politics just because of different people who have posted about the incident. He was jumped and in Hollywood as the protest was going down Highland Avenue, so not far from where the Kodak Theater is, where the Oscars are and all that. The protest is going down, and I see them mobbing and jumping and throwing fists at this guy who's all in black. And apparently he had lost his phone as well, and it was it was just sort of an unsettling incident in what would have been an otherwise, completely peaceful protest. So it's weird that they create or are willing to, that the mob is willing to create the very violence they say that they're standing against. And it wasn't that night, but there was the following, or 2 nights later when I showed up the second time, then I had the discussion with the person before the protest. I decided that was the best time. He was having a smoke break, before anything started. And so, we had the conversation. Then 15 minutes later, a guy comes up to me and says, "You don't belong here." And apparently he wasn't connected to the other guy. It's just that he saw that I was live streaming without a mask on, and he said, "That's a red flag." He said, "Plus I heard you mention previous actions." He's like, "That's another red flag. You better get out of here." And then I said, "Well, no, come talk to me and I'll tell you that I'm not what you think I am." Because and we had a conversation, and there were several times that I was, I guess I said ideology checked, where people came up to me and wanted to make sure I belonged. And I just did the best that I could to lay out that I was there, that I was, okay, here's the other thing that happened. That the memorial had been trashed 2 nights before by some young, folks who like to sort of get into it with Antifa aligned groups. In other words, presumably conservative, anti-protest types. Take it further than just speaking out and actually demolish the memorial to Daunte Wright and Adam Toledo. So that I think created the heightened tension of the situation that I was walking into. But I did post at the end of the night, I think I'm done, with live streaming, because you're just at risk. You're at risk because they can pinpoint you in the crowd, find you, and they can attack you physically. And again, that there is no, and this is the one point of criticism that I've been consistent about within the protest movement, is the use of violence. If someone doesn't agree with you, and you're going to use violence to try to shut them down, you run the risk, first of all, of being wrong, of shutting down somebody that it's like may even be politically friendly fire, but you end up, if your intel is wrong, then you end up mislabeling somebody, and you create violence for violence sake. It's not to mention that even if you were right, going against your political adversary, that in turn would breed more violence. And I feel like everybody read Romeo and Juliet, and we know this, and we know that violence begets more violence, and yet there's been very little commentary on that cycle, that vicious cycle of different political extremes willing to take to the streets and use violence. So I've been outspoken on that one point, and that's because it also affects people like you and people like me. We're out there just doing the job of the independent press, and yet violence is thrown at us, and threats. And I'm sure you've gotten the online, harangues that I have, and it comes from the right and the left. For me, it has, at least. I don't want to speak for you, but certainly it feels like it felt like, wow, we've been in this for nearly a year, and it doesn't seem that we as press are any less at risk than we were a year ago. And that worries me.
No, if anything, I think I would say even more at risk, because it seems that the sort of organizational structures that are in place now are more solidified than they were a year ago. I think that a year ago you did see a combination of organizations getting protests together, but also more organic, just sort of like groundswell of people from various different communities. And I think that's why you saw protests in so many different cities, especially early on there, like late May, early June. As time has gone on, it's the places that have had organizational structures that you've seen more sustained protests. And to be clear, I don't mean that in like a nationwide organization sort of way. I mean like individual cities, communities, people get groups together and they organize protests. And a lot of those are peaceful ones, but also then because it's a sustained group and it's some of the same people, they start to, I guess, delegate roles. And I don't know exactly the mechanics of what leads to a protest security team, but definitely the protests that you saw in like late May and early June, that was a lot less prevalent than they are now. And I'm sure if you ask them, they would have various different explanations as to why, various different threats they've gotten. But one of the side effects of that is that then there are these confrontations that are created between these security teams and the press. And I've seen it happen with so many other reporters in so many other places. And it's not just independent reporters. Like I've seen even mainstream people get confronted like that. It really goes to anybody that's doing any sort of press role. And I think it goes to what you said about like there's things that are within their control, and then there's people and entities that are outside of their control that aren't necessarily going to just spin a narrative for the sake of spinning a narrative, that will actually just report on it as it happens. And I think that either that is just so difficult to recognize and truly believe it really could be, and that's why they try to convince themselves it's something else, or they know that that's what it is, and that alone is enough of a threat that they feel that these actions should be taken. And I honestly don't know which one it is. I don't know if these labels are applied knowingly false, but they're just done as sort of another means to try to control entities or reporters or people that they see as uncontrollable, or if it's just truly just total misinformation and people really are convinced of this. Either way, the end effect is, as you said, that we're really no more better off than we were a year ago from a safety perspective.
Well, we've seen a spread of different tactics, and certainly one video I saw, have you seen an evolution in, for example, shields or techniques or protest culture and security culture? Those are two terms that an insider who I've been speaking with for months, who has been part of the anarchist scene since the late 80s into the 90s, used those terms. Especially security culture was interesting to me, because that really defines what you're describing, which is how people are coordinating within protest movements to essentially weed out or separate who they think is ideologically in line and should be there, and who isn't and should be kicked out and expunged, I guess, from whatever is going to happen. Because if things do accelerate, there are 2 points of logic in this security culture that I have come to understand, which is if things do accelerate, they want to be in charge of the messaging, of the of the propaganda, as it were, if it were to be used like that. So there's a lack of trust on one side. The other part of security culture is that if somebody is live streaming, and my audience, even if my audience is far right, let's say was an interesting question that the two journalists that I spoke with, the one who had falsely, posted about me. This is one of the most interesting questions they asked me. They said, well, who's your audience? And I was thrown by that because I thought to myself, well, that's not a question that I expected. Who's my audience? I don't know who my audience is exactly. It's very diverse. But their thought was, if your audience is made up of people who are against our cause, then you are giving them information to act on, to come and interrupt our proceedings and our actions. So in some ways, it's almost like security culture can reach this level of overprotectionism and even paranoia, where you think that the next far right group is right around the corner waiting to ambush, and sort of this insistence of protecting the group then becomes they extrapolate all the way to, well, who's watching you? Because if somebody's watching your stream that could partake in that, well, then that makes you responsible. So it gets into this like endless kind of free association, which doesn't just have to be you streaming. We see this all the time where people are free associated. Somebody commented earlier in the comment section that they did this to somebody else too, where you free associate, well, this person knows this person who knows this person, therefore this person is this. And that's sort of a very frustrating and exhausting apparatus to be up against, I would say, that ideology.
Absolutely. I mean, you're spot on with that. And it was similar sort of sentiment that was also brought up in the more extended conversation I had, the Grosse Pointe Park one, not the Detroit one, because it had just escalated to violence so quickly there. But yeah, it's this association. It's just multiple different layers of connection, and basically you're supposed to be responsible not just for what you're saying, but also for every single reply, and also for every single comment, and also for every single person that shares it. And you're supposed to be actively tailoring that. And if you can't tailor that, you're supposed to totally censor and just have no comments, or just have no replies, or just have no commentary like that. And that actually was their suggestion. Because I asked, well, I don't control the internet. Like I don't actually control the internet. That would be a very, very monumental task, and it would be a little bit too much for one person to do. And so that was one of their suggestions was, well, then why don't you just turn off all replies and all comments on all platforms? And it's, it's really, that's taking it to some pretty extremes from a press perspective. If you're going to be totally silencing any sort of commentary on something simply because one person might say something negative about this group, or what, things like that. And that's the logic behind it, though, that they try to make these, connections, these associations that aren't really there. And it's these very loose connections, but they kind of like force it as if it's a very strong connection. They'll take something that's a loose or non-existent connection and make it into something significantly stronger. And then, like you were saying, with sort of like this fear of like, oh, what's right around the corner? It was really interesting to see that in places like Detroit or Grosse Pointe Park, that are by no means areas that have seen large far right rallies, or that have seen huge demonstrations of people of that sort of ideology in any recent time. I think the closest thing to that would have been post November 2020 election. There were some protests outside of the TCF Center in Detroit, and those were predominantly Trump supporters, because it was people protesting the results of the election that were going in Joe Biden's favor at that time. And the largest that those had gotten was, I think, maybe like 100 people or so. Outside of the TCF Center there in downtown Detroit. I mean, that was just about it in terms of those kinds of demonstrations. So the level of security culture in a setting that really didn't necessarily warrant it, at least from an outside perspective, just looking at, where are these people marching, and like where is this demonstration actually taking place? Downtown Detroit, Greektown Detroit, these weren't exactly places that you were likely to see Proud Boys standing in a corner or something like that. So I think that there was a huge degree of that, just like, fear of these very niche things that weren't really likely to happen in all reality, and then taking action based on that.
It, in a way, my messaging would be that it only, if you're passionate about your cause, then there, trying to control it only makes people recoil more. In my opinion, the trying to shut people down does more harm than good. It can't do any good to silence people or try to control them. And you mentioned what people say on a feed, for example. If you post a video and then somebody says something offensive at some point, well, if there's incorrect information, obviously, as journalists, we want to correct incorrect information. That's, I think, comes with the territory. If somebody says something that's offensive, the other question becomes: do you engage with certain material? Because if you do, then it triggers the algorithm, and then it gets more popular than it needs to be. So in some case, the stupid comment that somebody makes that falls on deaf ears is getting exactly what it should, which is people saying, "Hey, that's a dumb comment. I'm not even going to dignify that." But what happens is because of it's the big social dilemma, right? Because of the ecosystem of social media, somebody says something, and if you over engage with it, then all of a sudden it gets more intention than is warranted. That's why I specifically, when they posted false information about me, I didn't engage with that post at all. Already, it had been picked up by a third-party site, one of these weird third-party sites that just takes popular tweets and aggregates them and redistributes them. So all of a sudden, my image was coming up from Google searches on this trending site that had somehow was gaming the algorithm. And the more, if I engaged with it, the more that the false information would get out. And I almost like to think that that's the same thing with an offensive comment. Well, the more you engage with it, the more that you end up promoting it in a way that that one doesn't want to. So it's really the conundrum of the social media dilemma that we're in, which is the more attention you give something, the more you end up promoting it inadvertently. And that's tricky, because the stuff that does trend is all stuff that's trending based on emotional outrage, and it's not necessarily true. And that's just a tough thing to deal with. And that's why, I've appreciated having conversations with you. I see some comments that people enjoy the raw content. Someone said old school, non-biased coverage of just giving people the raw deal. And I certainly have tried to do that. I think we have conversations like this where we break it down a little more and let people know what it's like to be out there and to be stuck in the crossfire. But in some ways, I mean, what do you think? I think I've said this before. If you're getting heat from both sides, then you're probably doing it right, because then everybody who is at a high-pitched, absolute extremist point of view is going to come at you pretty hard. In a pretty consistent way from what I have found. So going forward, how do you, we just both talked about some pretty harrowing experiences, and especially in your situation, it was physical. I was able to avoid the physical confrontation, but somebody in the comments, somebody mentioned the fellow's name in Hollywood that was jumped, and I did see that. And whenever I do see that, it's like, well, that I didn't know exactly what the situation was, but you wonder, well, if that's somebody who's documenting, I don't know what that person's ideology, but I could be perceived as that, and it could have been me. How do you move forward from this as far as being able to continue to give people honest coverage and stay safe out there?
I mean, it's an ongoing challenge. I think for me, everything that you just mentioned there, spot on, and it ends up just being so chaotic when you think about actually like taking it from this side and all these different considerations. It honestly just convinces me to go focus inward more and say, what is the core of what I'm trying to do here? What is the core of what this is all? Why is any of this happening? Why am I continuing to go out there in the first place? And that is to get true, no spin coverage of real events happening out to a greater public. And that is something, and just keeping the reporting honest, keeping the reporting, just sticking to the facts, not sticking to the emotions, not sticking to sort of the outrage culture. And this goes for really just any topic, any sort of, left or right wing. And if a piece of content ends up creating that outrage, it's probably because of what's actually taking place. But I don't want it to be because of the spin that was put on it when it was released, or because of the way that it was characterized or mischaracterized, especially. Really just with all of this, it's such a chaotic, tumultuous world. And I feel like that is just further encouragement to keep focusing inward, because honestly, it would take too much energy to try to cover all these different things and also do some spin with it, and also, be actively trying to curate, keep this information out, put this information in, really emphasize this, totally ignore this, all to try to create some sort of narrative. It's much better, I think, to just go and present all that information, all the relevant information at least, and then let people decide for themselves. And over time, my hope is that, that alone will hopefully create, enough of a diverse audience that people recognize that this is, the type of news and it's the type of reporting that really can reach anybody, that really anybody can get something out of it, get something of value out of it. And it's not necessarily tailored to any one group or any one specific person, because I don't feel that that's how this reporting should be. I mean, there is a place for commentators and for like opines, people that just kind of give opinions primarily. There's definitely a place for that with all of this. But I think that people misconstrue and start to believe that everybody out there is that type of person, that everybody out there is going just to try to get some sort of commentary, just so they can say this sensational thing about it at the end of the night, just so they can go on an interview and then say this. There are people that are out there really just trying to get the truth of what's going on. If it's an entirely peaceful protest, report on that. If it turns into violence, if it turns into apartment windows getting smashed or whatever, report on that. But I think that it's just become so complex, and there's so many layers to it all, that it's all the more encouragement to focus inward and try to just stick to the core of what got you into this field in the first place, what actually got you out and keeps you going out to so many different, demonstrations of all different ideologies.
Focusing inward, I like that, because that was the moment that I had to sort of say to myself, okay, don't become a participant and stream me confronting this guy. Because first of all, I'm not going to get an honest reaction. If he sees that there's a camera on him, then we're both, in a sense, locked into roles of performing and being something in front of an audience, which is different if you walk up to somebody and just deal with them one-on-one and say, look, you said something about me out there. It's not correct, and I'd like it to be retracted. So looking inward, in a sense, and just being honest with your own emotions, and to not get sucked into this for the sake, because the stuff that trends, the stuff that gets the engagement, is the scintillating, sensational stuff, and I think that the objective is so not be tempted. In other words, that you need to explain yourself and do more than exactly what you're describing, which is just documenting as you see events unfold. This is an interesting question. This is Stephen. He asks a question for both of you. Is there a point where you decide that there's already enough media covering an event, and you don't go? Brendan?
From time to time, I will sometimes factor it in. And this is more if I'm at a crossroads of multiple different things that I might otherwise cover, and then that may factor into a decision. Also, what I found with a lot of events is even if there's a lot of media there, they may all be focusing on one aspect of an event and not showing some other aspects. And so I feel like there's room in a lot of these events to kind of be a fly on the wall in other places that a lot of the main cameras are not focusing. But there are times when I'll just kind of refrain from it altogether. For example, like one of the most recent examples that I for sure was like, oh no need to be doing that. January 20th, the Biden inauguration. There were various different independent press that kind of hung out outside of the giant fencing perimeter that they had set up. And then, of course, the handful of like big mainstream outlets were actually let inside to cover the inauguration itself. But of course, anybody that's sort of independent is going to be on the outsides there. And I knew that there weren't really going to be large, wide-scale protests there, even though there was a lot of media hype around that leading up to January 20th. So instead there, I knew like there's enough media coverage of that. I wouldn't even personally be able to cover like right up there with the inauguration. So it focused my attention elsewhere. And instead I decided to go to Seattle that night and cover their direct action march that did not have hardly any cameras actually by comparison. So it ended up being a good decision there in terms of, had probably, I don't even know how many outlets, hundreds, if not 1,000, with you count the international press and whatnot, that'd be covering that versus events that have hardly any coverage. So it factors in sometimes, but there's other times too where if it's a really, really significant event, I'm aware that there's going to be a lot of media and I still go anyway. I would put Minneapolis in that same category. I just got back from there. It wasn't like I was going to be the only person with the camera outside of that Hennepin County courthouse as the verdict was read. Obviously, there were going to be other media there, but it was also just a really, really, really important moment to document for historic purposes. So there I decided, it's important to be there to document this moment in Minneapolis, regardless of how many other media outlets are there, even if everybody else has already got it covered from their own outlets.
Yeah. Inauguration, I ended up going because I was in DC before that, and I had the same reaction that you did. I said that people got it covered. I mean, the whole place was the Capitol was completely, is it still with barbed wire fence and razor wire and so forth? I mean, it's
not as much. It's been reduced, yeah.
But I remember being there. I think I was there on the 19th, and I decided to go to Sacramento. And I think I was the only person who was in that group. And that the Antifa Sacramento group, when they join up with Berkeley Antifa, sometimes they can get. I know you've been in that crowd before. They can be very animated. So I went there, and then I went to Portland later in the evening. So I did 2 flights, and caught 2 different marches, and that was at the ICE facility in Portland, which was kind of a constant staple of action. I think you were there a couple days before or later. In fact, we were both later, and then we were both in Tacoma, because then I went back to
that's right.
California, and then I went up to Tacoma. That was after the incident where groups were doing donuts in the, spinning their cars around, and then a squad car ran over somebody as it sort of plowed through. And so they had demonstrations there in Tacoma. I found that to be a tough crowd to kind of navigate, just because I saw a couple of guys who were being questioned and pushed out of that group. So I had a hard time filming in that group. And it really, it varies. Certain places you just feel it. You show up and you feel that it's tense and that people are being questioned, and you need to maintain a low profile. And it's just something you sort of get used to. But I've been seeing, in regards to your remark, that it feels like the security culture is getting more intense. I think certainly that played in what happened in Hollywood to me, played into me not going to Minneapolis. I think the whole thing just was enough to kind of get me to pull back. And I figured that there will be a lot. I'm glad you were there documenting it. There was a lot of press that was in Minneapolis, and I wanted to go, but in response to Stephen's question, I mean, sometimes for me in that situation, it was just, well, I had been through this whole ordeal where I had worked so hard for weeks to get false information removed about me. Now I'm going to go into Minneapolis where two groups there, because I requested to interview this, I guess you could say, kind of high profile legacy anarchist from the Minneapolis scene who's been around since the late 80s. Because I put that request in, two groups, radical groups in Minneapolis, actively have posted about me. And they've not blocked me. I've engaged with them online, but still, I had enough hesitation where I'd been through a whole ordeal in Southern California, and I just didn't want to go through another ordeal. And I said, I'm going to just pull back and rethink a lot of this for a little bit. And you certainly need these downtimes, these moments of downtime. I think the other question that folks, might want to know is how do you psychologically deal with being witness to so much violence on the street and so much disorder, and then animosity directed to you, whether it's from the right or the left, and how do you readjust from that and come down and keep yourself centered and sane so that you're out there, and in a moment like that where you're being attacked, we have more to lose if we react emotionally and fly off the handle and do something and take it and escalate the situation. That's our credibility on the line if we can't keep ourselves under control. So how do you meditate on that or prepare yourself to process all of this and then still maintain your cool out there in the street?
A lot of walks to clear the head, a lot of walks, and just trying to, take some time when I can, but there's just always so little. It's a big challenge. Honestly, that has been one of the things that, especially over these last few months, I've really been trying to kind of get a grasp on, is coping with the sheer volume of that I've witnessed, of the violence, whether it was towards me directly or just in general, witnessing it out on the streets. It's a lot, and it weighs on a person. And I think that's something that doesn't really get talked about too often with regards to all of this, because so much of the focus is on the coverage. And I would say, to an extent, and this may or may not be the healthiest thing for, ask a psychologist on this one, but I do kind of bury myself in my work with a lot of it, in terms of, there's a lot of coverage pretty frequently, trying not to let emotions get to me with regards to a lot of these events. But that being said, you just can't help it, and you just can't, you can't help but a couple of days after that, asking yourself, wow, was I really there when that moment happened? And it's heavy, and it's very heavy for some of these. And so, walking definitely helps, getting out in nature if possible. Sometimes just short drives to clear the head, things like that. Listening to music too, I would say as well, has been a big help with a lot of it. I would say it's an ongoing struggle though, and still working on trying to find the best solutions for that. So much of this has sprung up in this last year, like the really intense stuff, at least, even though protests in general have been going on for years, but the really intense has been largely in this past year. And I think that, that's an ongoing process of trying to figure out how to cope with that. I don't think that's been perfectly figured out yet by any means.
Yeah. I was just looking at different comments here on the side, and about how press has been targeted too, and how that can weigh on you. There's been a lot of graffiti that's against press, and it's hard to, when you're out there, it's as an independent, you want to say, well, look, nobody's paying my bills here except me, and I'm here doing this to get truth out, and supposedly we're all on the side of truth and not propaganda. One thing that I've witnessed in the Pacific Northwest just in the last week, I was looking. There was a local reporter up there named Justin who was attacked. He had his glasses broken. There's a woman who's actually an Antifa-aligned leftist who has covered protests, who all of a sudden they've turned on in the Pacific Northwest as well. And so I'm watching this unfold. and and I do think it's getting harder and harder to be out there. But you know, I don't know that I'm done. I think certainly live streaming is what I said, and local. It was tough for all that to go down in Los Angeles, where where I live, because that's like right on your doorstep, and you feel that it's a very unsettling feeling where you live to be confronted. In fact, this one woman who is an Antifa leftist aligned reporter, she is talking about moving, and it's like, I think you start saying stuff like that when you get enough, directed at you, that is hostility directed at you, that you're like, I don't want to go out here again and be a part of that, because being a target is, it's rough. And so I appreciate the work that you do. I know that you're out there, and you keep getting us the story from all kinds of events. Even when was it? You were down in Miami at one point, was it?
Oh yeah, Tampa for the Super Bowl win.
That's right, the Super Bowl win.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and this should be proof to the people that think that I am like somehow generating these protests ahead of time, like it's some movie or something. Like, oh yeah, like I also paid off the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to like make sure that they would win that day, and like made sure that all the teams were settled ahead of time, because like otherwise I would go all the way down to Tampa and nobody wins in Tampa. Like, how's that going to work? So no. And I joke about it because that was such a relief to cover an event like that wasn't like huge, intense, political, cutting edge of, American discourse, etc.
Yeah, no, it's just, but all the same, it's people, still revving up their engines and spinning donuts in the street and doing doing
some of the stuff was a little similar. Yeah.
You have some, you have some overlap. But that's funny, because what you say, actually Ford Fisher was getting, for this video that he has posted, I guess on 4chan, there's been some pretty, intensely vile comments that have come in his direction, because there was a piece of video in which a corrections officer got into it with the Black Lives Matter protests. This is Stillwater, Minnesota.
Okay, I did see that video. Yep.
In the same neighborhood of the prosecutor in regards to the Deontay Wright death. That was of course, as we remember, the taser, and the woman the police officer who's saying taser, and yet she fires her handgun. And so the prosecutor, they've had some protest outside. My understanding is that a video piece that Ford posted then made its way onto 4chan, and you get those kind of conspiratorial, that this is like actors, or this is manufactured somehow, because you do see someone behave badly and use the N-word in that video, a white person. And it's interesting, because we're dealing with these different obstacles that come in our direction. So it might be security culture at an event, whether it's the left or the right. And it may be sort of, well, you're making this up, or you're part of the adversarial group, and that labeling that goes with that, and just the kind of conspiracy thinking that somehow, as you said, you would have had to get all of Tampa Bay to conspire to put on the kind
get
of
them all
video.
out in the streets, close off all these roads. Like, let's bring it all in. I fly down a day ahead of time to coordinate it all. Got a checklist.
Exactly. You're on the headset with the offensive line. Yeah. You're a part of it. Yeah. No, we have very little ability to manipulate the course of human events, is what I have learned over this last year, is that as individuals. Now, the greater media is another story, because they do wield a lot of influence in how they portray and sensationalize certain elements. And now, in this age of viral news sharing, it is the most outrageous and the most colorful depictions that then get shared and reshared over and over again to where the rumor then becomes the truth. And so in that sense, there are bigger media apparatuses that I would say do wield that influence. But BG and myself, I am pretty secure in saying don't have that kind of pull.
No.
But people will be able to look back on your work, and I hope is mine as well. And maybe we'll reach a point in this country where we have political discourse that isn't. We'll be able to look in a more deliberate way on the events of this last year and this, and have a better understanding and higher political IQ and able to discuss these things. I hope as a country for both your sake and mine, because I certainly think that. All the content that we bring to the people and we go out and cover, I'm glad that we do it, and I hope that it becomes safer as opposed to going the opposite direction. And in the immediate future, tell people where they can find you. At BG on the Scene, of course.
Yep, at BG on the Scene. Yep, on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Those are my three main ones. Facebook as well. I try to get some posts out there too. Yeah. And also, if you're into sort of the more alt tech, there's YouTube. There's also Odyssey/Library. Some people know it as. That's a new one that I've seen a lot of independent creators, especially adopting over these last few months, because YouTube has gotten kind of iffy in terms of raw footage, allowing raw footage to just be on their platform without commentary, without somebody putting in countervailing points is what they usually call it. I know Ford's definitely got caught up in that, but a few other Status Quo News, just various independent outlets I've seen getting caught up in YouTube. So I also am on Odyssey and regularly have stuff posted there too. Yep. And all that's just at BG on the Scene, at BG on the Scene.
At BG on the Scene. I'm going to put one more question to both of us, presumably as well, but it says, Jeremy Lee Quinn, how do you stop a lie that has become the truth? And that's the tough one, which is is that when you see so much misinformation out there, I don't know that you can necessarily stop it, but you can make the actual deliberate parsing of information more accessible. You can communicate it better. You can show that you are honest and willing to take criticism as well. And I mean, I certainly, the guy who I called it a soft dox. He just pointed me out in the crowd with a lot of incorrect information. I said, you're welcome to come onto the live stream and even dissect my work. If you have transparency is goes a long way, I think, in confronting the lie. Because if you say, look, you can bring it, tell me what you have an issue with. And I think people who are operating honestly are willing to do that, and hopefully we get more of that out there. Everybody, thanks for joining us. I'm going to be live again tomorrow and on Wednesday. So everybody check out the live stream tomorrow, 1 p.m. Pacific. This is Unblocked Live. My guest has been BG on the Scene. Follow him, check out his work. I certainly appreciate it, and I know this audience does as well. And thank you all for being here and for your questions. Sorry I didn't get all to everybody, but check in at noon tomorrow and Wednesday, and we'll all talk more. Thanks for joining us on Unblocked Live.